All right, welcome to week 6. You've made it halfway through. This week we turn at last to the poetic portions of the Old Testament, starting with the wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, which are probably my favorite parts of the Old Testament. Now, Arnold does an outstanding job in chapter 17 of setting the Hebrew wisdom tradition in its ancient Near Eastern setting, so I'm going to focus on the literary and theological messages of these books. First, we examine the book of Job, and in particular, the way its approach to the problem of suffering is superior to what one typically encounters in contemporary culture. Unfortunately, this includes also many Christian approaches to the problem of suffering. One of my main points is that dialogue itself, especially dialogue with God, is at the heart of Job's message and theology. And second, we look at the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is, as I've said, one of my favorite books of the Bible, both to study and to teach. But because of the nature of the book of Proverbs, that it is a collection of many very short sayings, to go much deeper than a very brief introduction would require in-depth exegetical studies that just don't fit into the scope of this course. So I've included a page giving some practical guidelines for how one may get the most out of the book of Proverbs. My hope is that these guidelines will also help you when you are teaching the book of Proverbs, because if you are not already teaching the Bible, many of you are, you will be. So I want you to have tools at your disposal to get the most out of Proverbs, because it's a great source for teaching. I've also included an example of a lesson I once taught in my church on Proverbs 10:26 to illustrate those guidelines, as well as other principles of biblical interpretation that maybe you can use as you're preparing your final paper. Now, third, I want to take another look at the issue of retribution theology. I mentioned that last week, as it pertains to the Hebrew wisdom literature, the book of Proverbs, and the relationship between Proverbs and Job. Now, in the interest of brevity this week, so that you have plenty of time for the quiz, plenty of time to work on the upcoming final paper, I'm not going to spend any time on the third main branch of Hebrew wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes. Let me just say this. Though the interpretation of Ecclesiastes is a very difficult enterprise, I believe it to be not only valuable but absolutely essential for the modern Western Church that the Church's leaders wrestle with this difficult text and attempt to teach its complex message. Now, many of the principles that we're going to bring out in studying Job and Proverbs are going to pertain to Ecclesiastes, so it does work. It does fit. It's just we don't have time really to deal with it much at all. But I'm going to recommend to you, if you want to go more in depth in Ecclesiastes, Tremper Longman III's 1994 commentary in the New International Commentary in the Old Testament series, Nikot series, as well as the more recent ongoing work on the subject of Ecclesiastes by Stuart Weeks. If you're willing to read academic monographs, there's a link to a book by Weeks down below, or look up his articles on JSTOR. I heard a paper presented by Weeks several years ago, and his insight into the text is profound and extremely helpful, and his language is accessible. All right, have a great week. Look forward to seeing your comments on the discussions.